Hello, hello, and welcome back to another Redefining Everything conversation where everything is up for discussion. And today I have my friend, Dr. Erin Baker, back for another conversation. And I am really, really excited today to talk about redefining gender, redefining sexuality, everything else that we might fit into under those umbrella topics, also how it relates to what we do at Redefining Sobriety and the reasons why we numb or turn to alcohol. It's obviously a super important topic that I don't think gets talked about enough in terms of how it relates to those other two topics that I brought up around gender and sexuality. And so we've heard from you, Erin, and we have had another conversation about motivation and ambition and validation and how we seek that out in our lives. You're a social psychologist, and you also have a background in doing gender awareness work. And so I'd love to hear that part of your introduction because I don't think we heard that last time.
Yeah, and I don't know if I've said it to you in person. So I got started with this work back, 2005, 2006, when I was at University of Michigan as a student. And I'd come out of the closet as not heterosexual and ended up working at an LGBT office there where there was a trans guy who became my mentor. And he taught a workshop series on gender that just blew my mind. I had never thought about gender and sex and sort of the nuances of what it means to be male or female, what it means to be transgender, how that relates to your sexuality. So I started thinking about it for myself and wondering, well, what does this mean for me? Who am I? And I spent the next 10 years kind of learning more about it, teaching workshops. I taught workshops in San Diego. I have taught workshops online a little bit. And now I'm really excited to talk to you about sort of what I've learned, or intellectually, but also what I've learned about me personally. And I'm wearing, just for this, Too Cute for a Gender Identity, and I can explain a little bit what gender identity means as we go along.
And I love that you're wearing that shirt. And I'm also really grateful that you brought this up as a topic that you wanted us to record a conversation about. And it made me realize as you were doing your introduction that there's like a part of my story that many folks haven't heard either, which is that from the time I was in high school, I was involved in youth advocacy work. I did a lot of education and peer education around sexuality and then around kind of like diversity in general. So we sort of had this umbrella group where we did a lot of just work around inclusion. And there was an attempt at a gay-straight alliance, as it was called back then. And then when I was finished high school, basically a couple of years after high school, I came out as queer. And so I have a whole other sort of personal experience. I wouldn't say that it was the focus, although I worked for Youth Co-Aid Society and worked in an environment that was, very oriented towards activism across the board as it had to do with sexuality and sexual health. But in my personal life, I don't think a lot of people know this, but one of my first very significant relationships, we were engaged, was to someone who was going through transition from female to male. And then after that, I was in a relationship with a woman for a long time. And it's funny because I don't really talk about it that much just because it's not like the thing that's relevant in this moment in my life, I guess. Yet that experience is obviously a really big part of me. Like I wouldn't say that I could even separate myself from that large portion of my late teens and 20s when I was really much more kind of actively a part of that community. And I think it would be really cool for this conversation, just as you said, to talk a bit more about gender identity, what that means. I think there's a lot of awareness that's starting to happen right now, especially in the spaces that we're in and online spaces around how do we talk about this in a way that is respectful and inclusive and not making assumptions. And then also, I'd love to talk a bit about how this affects the redefining sobriety conversation as well. So where do you want to start?
I guess probably we should start with some definitions because I think there are some people out there who just don't know when we talk about gender, when we talk about sex. And so, I mean, sort of the basics are that sex is your biology, which is your hormones, your chromosomes, what body parts end up expressing themselves. And then your gender is more your internal sense of maleness or femaleness. And something that's really interesting is that I was looking up some data this morning just to remember some stats I'd heard a long time ago, but 1 in 100 people are born that don't fit the category of male sex or female sex. 1 in 100.
That's a lot of people.
Yeah, so I did the math and it was like, okay, so the American population, that's like 3.25 million people in America. And then we look at the whole world population, 75 million. So
Wow.
75 million people out there don't fit into the medical definition of male sex or female sex. And 1 in 1,000 actually have surgery to normalize their body, whether it's when they're born, the doctors see something and fix it. And so the range of what your sex could be is so different based on whether your hormones are a little different or maybe you have chromosomes that are different. And so why wouldn't you then say, well, gender isn't just sort of a two box thing. There's no just male box and female box. And so gender is really more your internal sense. So gender identity really is like, how do you feel? Do you feel highly male? Do you feel highly female? Do you feel somewhere in the middle? Do you feel like you don't even fit on the line? And then the last thing is sort of how do you express that gender? So you might feel one way on the inside, like you might feel like you're completely male on the inside, but you might express yourself as more female. And that can be really confusing for people in society because they look at you and they see, well, oh, I have to categorize that person. I need to know for my own safety, is that a male or female? But what they see is not necessarily what you feel. Mm-hmm. It's a really interesting sort of salad of different things that might be going on for someone.
And it's so, obviously this has been prevalent for years and years and years, and we have a different way of talking about it now. But I feel like even with the increased awareness, there's still such a desire, as you said, like a cultural imperative almost, it feels like, to categorize kids, people in general, but what just came to mind as you were talking about that is, now there's this whole thing, and you see it on social media all the time, these gender reveal parties, which even that, they call them gender reveal for babies, which is false, because if we follow the definitions you just talked about, like your baby is born like with a sex, right? And their gender is something that comes more, as you explained, from the inside out. And I've even said that, like, oh, we only talk about, the sex of your baby. They're like, no, the gender, And then they have these gender reveals. So it's like the blue balloons come out of the box. And so it's really prescribing based on the anatomy of your fetus or your infant, what their gender is going to be. So, it's obviously been happening for years and years and years. But what I found really interesting is even with, I feel like we're slowly moving towards a culture of more acceptance and learning, and maybe with some of this information that you shared, that like there's so many of us who don't fit like these what have been considered very kind of defined categories, but like there's still this need that people seem to have to like prescribe gender from the get-go.
Totally. And I was talking about this with a colleague the other day. One of the things that I find so tragic is when someone decides to actually transition. So they decide, you know what, I was born female, but I feel really male inside and I want to become male, or the other way around. They're born male and they want to become female. And I see this pendulum that they swing of like overexerting what it like stereotypically means, especially, and this happens a lot with males who become female. You see them wearing the high heel shoes and the pink, and they're like trying to prove that they are female enough. And it's like there's this box that they have to fit into, and they're subverting the cultural scheme even more to some standard. And I think some of the people I've seen and that I respect the most are the people who say, you know what? Yes, I transitioned my sex, but my gender identity or my gender expression, I can still wear a tie if I'm female. I can still wear, if you transition to male, I can still wear a skirt or whatever, because just because I change my sex doesn't mean I have to now fit into a new box. But it's so tragic to me that still happens, that there's still this discomfort with anything that's in between or that isn't easily categorizable.
Yeah. And I think it's not just with relation to sex and gender. I mean, obviously, just as humans, I don't know, you're a social psychologist, so tell me, where does is it because it was sort of a survival need at one point where we needed to know, to be able to predict sort of safety, therefore we've, instinctively forever kind of been very quick to make those snap judgments so that we then know, this is safe, this isn't safe, this is I mean, where there must be a kind of evolutionary or biological imperative for those kinds of judgments.
Yeah, there's an absolute biological imperative, and it's the brain wants to make sense of the world, whether it's categorizing or just understanding, what's happening in the environment. And so part of it, is that really ingrained, fight or flight, right? So is this safe or is this not? Is this edible? Is this not? Is this a bird or is this not? And so, the brain really strives to have certainty, to make sense of the world, to know how it's supposed to interact with the world. And when we are uncertain, we then feel unsafe. And so, we strive to then create safety by saying, well, there's all kinds of ways you can create safety. You can verbally abuse the other person. You can physically abuse the other person. You can just say, I refuse to accept that you are what you are. I'm going to call you X. Or you can even stick to sort of there are only two sexes, there are only two genders, and they're the same thing. That creates your sense of internal safety. So there's a lot of different ways that people kind of create that safety for themselves, but it is absolutely rooted in a biological need for safety.
So then how do we start to create that shift now, given that it's not, for the most part, a life or death situation, although as I'm saying that, tragically it becomes that, but not for the people that really have nothing to fear, which are the perpetrators of violence, usually against, I think that's the extreme manifestation that we still see of that fear of difference, where there is so much violence particularly against trans folk. What do you see right now that is helping shift the conversation and create those conditions for safety, not only for people who are part of the communities who don't kind of fit with the norm, but for anybody who might be watching this and being like, well, I have felt triggered, or this has been hard for me when I don't understand how I'm supposed to relate to somebody or what I'm supposed to call them. How do we start moving in that direction of more of safety for all of us to feel like we can embrace difference rather than reject it?
Yeah, I think that's a really tricky question, but it also, I think about how sexuality has taken its journey from the last few decades of being more of an acceptable thing, right? People were scared to see two gay men holding hands or kissing, and that's become more and more acceptable in society. And I think there's kind of two things I've noticed. One is people having the courage to tell their story. And, I've come out to my friends and family about how I feel, and they love me enough to say, help me understand. And then once they understand, they can kind of evangelize, and it's a ripple effect. I think the other is more like popular media exposure. I don't think people who kind of identify in the middle of the gender spectrum have been very well represented, but there's more and more trans people being represented in TV shows. I just read an article maybe like a week ago about the top 20 trans actors and actresses and the different shows they're in. And I'm like, that's amazing. That exposure just creates more normalization. But I think, the open dialogue that people can have with their loved ones, and it does require a little bit of labor on those of us who are experiencing an otherness with our gender to be open to those conversations and be forgiving if people don't get it right on the first try. But it's going to be a slow process, because gender/sex, I mean, that's one of the basic tenets of like who you identify. You look at someone, you go, that person's male or female, they have blue eyes or green eyes, they're tall or short. I mean, it's such a basic ingrained category that we can't expect that tomorrow everyone's going to feel great and safe. But the little by little with these conversations, I think we can get it started.
Yeah, and it's so important. Like, it's just, it really, really is, because, you know, you and I were chatting before we started recording, and statistically, people who are part of like what would, I don't like this word, but like be considered kind of like a sexual minority, or not the norm, or, you know, trans people are really, like high rates of across the board of, you know, challenges with mental health, with suicide, with addictions, with, you know, alcohol and drug abuse. And, you know, something that I know for me, being a part of when I was, as I said, in my late teens and early 20s, like in the queer community, you know, it was very much the way we, and it still happens, you know, I know because some of my friends are still doing those parties, and, you know, and I mean, they're great. I love the parties for creating those safe and celebratory spaces. And there's a lot of focus on alcohol, as there is in across the board in a lot of different cultures, but we know statistically that the rates of alcohol abuse, are per capita are higher, and we see like pretty dire and extreme you know, circumstances sometimes, on shortened life expectancy, particularly for trans people. And you know, I know, like, one of my personal desires is that we can hopefully in not too much time as a culture move towards a place of more acceptance, so that it's also not just like I get to be me in this environment over here, like this party that happens here or in this bar, you know, and also that I need alcohol to help get me to that place where I feel comfortable expressing myself fully, you know. You know, yeah, anyways, there's more I could say on that, but. And
yeah, I've seen a lot of that. So I've lived in a few different cities, and there's noticed differences in what the LGBT community is like in those cities, what kind of the party scene is like, what the acceptance is. And I can just see sort of the evolution of, you know, certain cities have gotten to a place where you can be in any space and be safe. And I think the party scene and the mental health issues are much reduced when you can walk out in the world and you don't have to go hide away at a bar to find your people. You can find your people at the park, or you find your people at a coffee shop. And then when I've noticed, you know, I've been in small town America, and I've seen some of the ways people hide there. And, you know, it's not that they have their own gay bar to go to, but the bar is the place where they can go forget for a minute that they're different. And I think it's really imperative to create more safe spaces and more safe cities where people don't have to find each other in this one narrow location that doesn't necessarily lead to good outcomes. You know, I think living in Austin was one of my first realizations. I could be anywhere in Austin. There were a couple gay bars, but like I could be anywhere in Austin and it was totally fine. And it was at first very strange to be able to walk down the street and know that nobody was going to worry about what my gender was, what my sexuality was. And there are just not enough cities out there like that. And there's not enough people who can move to those cities. Mm-hmm. So it's, yeah. And I think the online world is creating a lot of safe spaces for people. So if you're in a smaller town, there are communities online for helping. But then, you know, I think there's still a lot more work to be done especially in these smaller towns, rural America, where, especially right now in the political climate, where, you know, acceptance is actually going from fairly high to much lower.
Oh, yeah. It's scary, you know, because I really do believe, and I see this with all of the different communities of people that I work with. Like, I think one of the most painful experiences for us as a human being is to like deny the truth of who we are. And many of us, for different reasons, do that. And it's really painful when we are betraying in a daily, when we're in a daily, process of self-betrayal, or a cycle of self-betrayal, we numb from that. Like, I really do feel like that is one of the most painful things that can happen to us. It's a form of self-abuse, really, is that when we know there's something to be true about ourselves, and yet we're trying to push that part of ourselves away. Mm-hmm. And like I said, many different people experience that for different reasons. But then you add on sort of the family dynamic, family of origin stuff, potentially religion, feeling like you can't be yourself in your community, you can't be yourself in your country, even, that's a really painful reality to live with, that like there is something like this fundamental part of who I am isn't accepted, and it can't be expressed to its fullest. And so it's no wonder that people numb from that, and then, as you said, so there's that part of it, but then there's also if your only options for connection are in spaces where alcohol is served, and, or that's also what you learn from a fairly young age, to give you permission to express those parts of yourself, then it becomes really ingrained that, I was working with a man who I think was, he was in his 40s, a gay man, and married, and, in a really stable relationship, in a good place in his career. And his entire life, sort of in terms of his sexuality, had only ever been explored or expressed under the influence of alcohol and or drugs. And so even though he was in a place in his life of relative safety and stability and love, it was like this deeply ingrained way of being, it's like that's just what he knew. And he didn't know how to access that part of himself, or how to give himself permission to express his sexuality fully, or even to to have sex without being under the influence. And, he's one of probably, many, 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 many examples.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And this is why your work is so important, and hopefully it can reach some of these people who wouldn't necessarily traditionally reach out, because really getting in touch with, first of all, it's just about being okay. And second thing is realizing that the societal norms and expectations are really embodied in you by the time you're in your 20s and 30s, and that, there are paths to get that out of your body and be more comfortable, but you may not be able to do it on your own. And I think a lot of people don't know that that's where they need help. And in traditional therapy may not always be the right route to go, because some therapists don't believe in LGBT stuff, or, they may not treat the whole society plus person in the same way that someone who's really specializing in it would. So I just think your work is so important, and I hope more people, you're mostly geared towards women, but like as a queer, gender fluid, whatever I call myself, person, I still feel very comfortable working with you. And I hope this can inspire others to potentially say, well, maybe I can listen to a little bit of what Caitlin's saying, even if I'm not, who Caitlin's website says I'm supposed to be.
Yeah, maybe we should work on that a little bit too. I'm glad you said that. Thank you. And also that's the thing. I think it's really interesting. You and I met in person, and, over the course of our first meeting, I outed myself, and we had I think connection that went deeper than just what you might read if you went to my website copy. So I'm actually really glad that you brought that up, because it, as I said, it's been really interesting for me recently, seeing a lot of these conversations really spring up in a really important way. And then realizing that like who I am on the inside too, who my life experience is, and how I grew up, I also grew up with lesbian parents, and, I had a very sort of unique upbringing, and, and my sexuality also isn't what people assume that it is when they look at me, based on my gender expression.
I love the same way. She wants to tattoo like queer on her forehead when she goes out dancing so that women will dance with her.
Yeah. And so it is interesting because obviously, like, I do care passionately about this topic as it relates to this sort of like not like the completely like the mainstream heterosexual identifying, more femme presenting cis women out there. But that's how I'm perceived, right? So there was something I was going to say about this. Oh yeah, it's just also I think you mentioned something about people not realizing that there is support and maybe being hard on themselves for not being able to figure this out. And I think that's such an important point, because if you're listening to this and you, like, I don't want it ever to come across like the example that I just gave of a client of mine still using alcohol, like, even though in his life he had all of the reasons why he shouldn't, that there's something wrong with that, because it's completely normal that he would still be using alcohol, because the parts of him that learned to depend on that substance are not who he is now. So if we're only operating in and this is what happens a lot, right? But I'm together and I'm a professional and I'm married and or I'm in a stable, committed relationship, or what's wrong with me? Like, why can't I get a handle on this part of my life? Or like, why can't I get turned on when I'm sober? Or why do I all of a sudden feel really insecure or uncomfortable in my body? What's wrong with me? Like, I should be better at this now. I should, and it's really important to remind yourself that the part of you that learned to express themselves through alcohol is a much younger part of you often. And we, in some ways, like, we're still there. There's a lot of us that are still there, and it actually, in certain circumstances. And so while we might feel like we're adulting, we're doing a relatively good job of adulting in other aspects of our lives, like, these parts of ourselves that are so deeply connected to our feelings of self-worth, of how much we like ourselves, of what we think we deserve from another person, of how comfortable we feel in our bodies. These are much younger, more tender, more vulnerable parts of ourselves. And it takes often in a supportive kind of therapeutic environment or relationship to be able to peel back all of the protective layers that we have, to actually get in touch with those parts of ourselves that we have all of these coping mechanisms and defense behaviors and everything piled on top of, but to actually kind of reacquaint ourselves with those tender parts of ourselves, those young parts of ourselves, and understand like why we started using in the first place, and revisit that. And I know you've had an experience. I don't know if I'm going to bring it up. You can decide if you want.
I want to open book.
We went and we revisited a young part of you at a retreat in Mexico. And, maybe you can share a little bit just from your personal experience, what some of that has been like. Not, you don't have to, obviously go into detail, but like what it's been like to revisit, or to not even revisit, to visit for the first time, like these parts of yourself that are, the more vulnerable parts, or the younger parts, the parts that, where these other behaviors then kind of stemmed from. What was it like for you to go back?
Yeah. I'm just going to say in general, we started working together almost a year ago, which is crazy. And one of the pieces of things I really wanted to work on was trying to figure out if I wanted to have top surgery. So this was before I went to my younger pieces, but peeling back the layers. And one of the pieces is we often confuse what society expects of us from what we want. And so I was having this decision around top surgery. And I remember you and I working really hard to get deep into what was my sense of my body. What did I want to wake up feeling like? And when it came down to things, I was feeling this tension between what society would accept of me and what I wanted. And so that was kind of the first piece of like revisiting my body, because all the stuff you're talking about intellectually, I feel, I'm loved, I should feel good, I'm successful. That's all up here. Down here, we're cut off from. And so I was really cut off from that. I was cut off from my body, and I was cut off from my childhood for sure. So then getting back in touch, I was so uncomfortable during this exercise that you did with me. And now that I've taken a coaching course and know exactly what it's all about, I'm like, I see you, Caitlin. I know what you were doing. But it was super uncomfortable. But that particular thing that we released that day, like, I had not been able to get over this. I had used this example of this particular thing that had happened to me for 10 years as to why I had all these issues around success and achievement and why I wasn't enough. And that one moment where you took me back and had a conversation with my younger self completely released it. Like, it's all it took. And I have not used that story as an excuse anymore. And in fact, like, I feel like I've made peace with that story. But I think we don't know, because we're trying to intellectually say, well, I know that's just a story. I know that's just a story, until you really say, like, let's close our eyes. Let's revisit that child. What was that child really wanting? What can you say to that child now? That was really, really impactful for me. And it actually led to, I think later that day, I experimented for the first time taking my shirt off after my surgery, because I was like, you know what? This is something my inner child has wanted to do since I was 5. And I had the safety of one of our close friends sitting next to me, and I said, I'm just going to do this.
Mm-hmm. That shivers. Even though I knew that had happened, I just hear you say it again. I literally just had full body shivers.
Yeah, I mean, since I was a kid, and this is something I rejected for a long time, I didn't want to be a boy, but I didn't want to be a girl. And there were certain aspects of it, you know, guys got to walk around without their shirts on. And I wanted that. And from like a really little kid time. And that moment was just so special to be like, I can do that now. And that doesn't make me a male. And if I want to, I can say I'm still female. It doesn't make me any less female. Just makes me me.
Yeah.
So that was pretty magical for me.
Yeah. Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing that. I know I kind of put you on the spot. We didn't talk before the call about I didn't know we were going to bring that up.
Anyone who wants to talk to me about this stuff, I'm a completely open book about it. It's so important to me to share my message and my story about this. Because there are other people out there that have come to me. I had not known what they were struggling with, and my openness and transparency has allowed them to feel the safety to explore their own selves. And I'm hoping there's someone out there watching right now who's like, wow, this is something I'd never thought about myself. Thank you for showing me that that's a possibility to explore.
And I'm also really grateful too that you could share how in this one exercise, something that you had known intellectually shifted on such a profound level for you. So it's something you talked about in therapy before, and you kind of revisited that scenario. But through being led through this more kind of physical embodiment exercise, which, you know, we're talking about this too in our gender expression, you know, it is in our body. And so even though that particular instance like wasn't even really related to your gender identity, it like there's so much that lives in our bodies, and it takes us being embodied. And as you said, sometimes we really are like have professionally almost cut ourselves off from our bodies. And so being in that, like starting to seek out, and if you're watching this and you don't have it yet, you know, as Erin said, reach out to Erin, reach out online if you don't have somebody physically close to you who you can start to maybe talk to, and start to explore how you can find safety in order to like start the journey back to yourself. Start the journey back into your body or into your sexuality, and knowing that if you feel like there's work or transformation or healing that you want to do, the most powerful and profound and really, I believe, kind of holistic and sustainable way we can do it, like where it really does become becomes our new reality, our new experience of ourselves, is to create some sort of embodied healing experience, because we can't think our way through it. And that's where a lot of like talk therapy or just reading books and things like that, it's great. And I also really do believe that we have to have these embodied experiences, especially when what we're struggling with directly relates to our bodies and our experience of our bodies. And that's also where this question of alcohol and drugs comes in too, because we numb ourselves from really truly experiencing our own bodies, right? Mm-hmm. And so finding our way back to ourselves also often means like redefining our relationship with these substances that have for a long time like served many purposes, but also at the end of the day really do, like, while we think that they open doors, and they might have in the beginning, and it's not super black and white, I don't think, and this is a topic that I want to write more and explore, and I did a research paper in college about it, interviewing other queer women. Some of us used alcohol for really important reasons to, like, especially those of us who've experienced trauma, it was a way to get out of our heads and to turn off like and to like have the ability to experiment sexually or to be in our bodies. But then the issue was then, well, when did it become too much? And then when do we actually numb ourselves off from that experience or potentially put ourselves at risk? There's such a rich topic. There's so much. There's so much in this conversation.
Well, and given how rich this is, an example, I was talking to someone on Friday, and it started off being a work conversation that turned into a 2.5 hour talk on gender, and we weren't done when we decided to call it quits. And it was just scratching the surface of some of these things, because it's such a complex gender and sexuality and how you show up in the world and what makes you comfortable and what spaces you can inhabit and you can't inhabit it safely. It's a rich conversation that needs to be happening in so many different circles.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm so grateful that we're having the conversation today, and I hope we can continue it. And I just remembered something else that you had mentioned earlier that I wanted to touch on, which is that as you were talking about the experience of going back and revisiting your younger self, I had this moment of thinking, if somebody's listening to this and that seems like something that's really difficult to do, and I understand that, because if you've experienced abuse, isolation, neglect, rejection as a young child, if there's a lot of pain associated with who you are as a child, it can be really difficult to think about going back to that space. So we're not in any way suggesting like, go do this right now by yourself. That this is something, and Erin, I know you could probably speak to this. This was able to happen over the course of, we've been working together for a while. You were in a super safe environment with the people around you, you really trusted them. And it was as a result of other work that you've done to be able to get you to that place. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh, hell no, like, you're not taking me back there, that's a complete, that is a very natural response to that, and the idea that we should just like jump back into our childhoods if they were painful and traumatic for us is not what we're suggesting right now at all, but that it is something that happens through, finding those supportive relationships, those people who you can start to, as Erin gave some examples, building those connections with your friends and family, or reaching out to somebody online, possibly working with a coach or Erin or myself, or, that it's part of a healing journey, but not necessarily something that we would ever recommend unless you feel really called to, and it's a whole body yes, like, let's do this, I feel ready, but even so, I really do think that a therapeutic relationship with people who are trained in the process to guide, like, we're almost like, we are guides, guiding the people that we work with back to themselves, and that we can also help you see parts of yourself that are really difficult to see, on our own sometimes, because we've become so good at unseeing parts of ourselves, so anyway, I just felt like that was important to mention.
Yeah, it is super important, because I think by the time we'd gotten there, it was 6 or 7 months after we've been pretty intensely working through different ways. But I'd also have to say, like, it had taken me 10 years of contemplating a top surgery before I felt like I had any clarity about what I really wanted. And that clarity could only come from having someone else help me see things in a way that I wasn't thinking about them. And it's okay that it took me 10 years. And I think, for a lot of people, there's a lot of risks around doing anything to alter your body, and there's a lot of fear around it. And so finding a place where you can start back with the very basics and move yourself towards the deeper and deeper, like you said, peeling back the layers. I had no idea what the layers were that were contributing to my hesitancy. And so now I can look back on that and go, I can't believe I didn't see that in hindsight for the last 10 years. But I probably would still be here today if I hadn't had that help. I'd still be, not with a flat chest. 6 months after surgery with, happiest I've ever been in my body.
Yay.
Just last week, I think my wife said, I think your posture's changed. And I remember when we were in Mexico several months ago, you said, we need to work on your posture. So, that's an embodiment of freedom and happiness and being, like, really comfortable in how you show up in the world.
Erin, I love you to pieces. I'm so grateful that you're in my life and that we met and that we are having this conversation, and I definitely want it to continue. And I'm also committing, as we're recording right now, to finding ways to get this message out there more and have this conversation specifically around redefining gender and sexuality and safe spaces, as it relates also to alcohol and substance use, and finding our way back to ourselves. But making this, like, I just feel that it's starting to happen, but it's not a part of the dominant conversation, and there's still not enough resources, I think, or in the way that we work and we approach this topic also around redefining sobriety. And like, there are just as many as there's infinite possibilities for our gender and our sexual expression. There also are, as infinite possibilities for redefining our relationship to everything, including what we put into our bodies. And they could seem like completely separate things, but ultimately I think it's very similar, that we all have a right and are worthy and deserving of finding what is best for ourselves, whether that's what we express outwardly into the world, or what we receive, and what we choose to put in our bodies as well.
So true.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you are listening and you want to know more about Erin, we will put all of Erin's contact info in the notes underneath and on the show notes, and reach out, please. Let us know what you thought of this episode. Let us know if you have any questions, and we can for sure record a follow-up conversation. So please do reach out to myself and or to Erin. We'd love to continue this conversation conversation. Obviously, we probably will a million times over, but in terms of recording it and sharing it publicly, let us know what you'd like to hear. Or if there's anything that we didn't cover, also. So if you have any questions about what we talked about, let us know. If there were things that we didn't talk about, but you want to hear more about from us, please do let us know, and we will record another conversation. Anything you want to add, Erin?
No, the only thing I was going to say is I will also send you a couple links to add to this for some resources on books around gender that are really helpful. There's one book in particular called My Gender Workbook that helps people work through their own sense of gender. It's really fabulous.
I love it. Perfect. Yeah. So yeah, we'll include those with the show notes as well.
Cool.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I can't wait to keep the conversation going.
Me too.
Bye.